Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to give a defense of a view known as referential pluralism. So this is a topic in philosophy of language. It concerns the nature of reference. I am going to be just assuming a basic understanding of this debate, so this is not an introductory video. I'm just presenting a view that I think is plausible. Yeah, so just to maybe give a bit of background, when I say the name, John Cage, right, in doing so I refer to a particular individual, specifically a famous American composer. How does this work? Well, theories of reference try to explain explain how it is that words refer, how it is that words come to be hooked up to things in the world. Now, many philosophers have assumed that reference is monistic. There is one kind of reference relation, so one correct theory of reference. This is referential monism. I'm more inclined towards referential pluralism, which is a view that is outlined and criticised in an article called Against Arguments from Reference by Mallon, Macquarie, Nichols and Stitch. There hasn't been much written on referential pluralism though. There's another article by James Andow which defended it, but beyond that it has had very little influence in the literature. So let's begin by stating a bit more clearly what exactly referential pluralism is. Well, in philosophy of language there are two traditional accounts of reference. There is the descriptive theory and the causal theory. According to descriptivism, names abbreviate a description or a set of descriptions, and these descriptions determine the referent of the name. The name John Cage refers to John Cage because it is associated with the description "the composer of 433", and this description is satisfied by a single individual, namely John Cage. There is one object in the world that the description "the composer of John Cage" is true of. Since this description is attached to the name John Cage, the name John Cage refers to that one individual. And we can tell a similar story for kind terms. If we think about the term mercury, well, this picks out a particular kind of stuff. I mean, it's not picking out like one individual, it's picking out a kind of stuff that, I might have in a vial, or that, might exist in some salt, or, whatever. According to the descriptive theory, the term mercury picks out whatever substance satisfies a certain set of descriptions. And in the case of mercury, these descriptions might be, for example, is an atom that contains 80 protons, is liquid at room temperature, is about 13.5 times denser than water, whatever. The term mercury is associated with this set of descriptions. A substance is mercury just in case it satisfies these descriptions. So the general idea is that each kind term is associated with a set of descriptions, and the term refers to whatever entity or set of entities satisfies these descriptions. So that probably seems fairly obvious, maybe even trivial, but there are powerful arguments against descriptivism. For example, it seems like you can correctly use a word to refer to a person or a thing, even if you know nothing about that person or thing. I might ask somebody, "Who was John Cage?" Where the only thing I know about John Cage is that he was famous for some reason. Obviously, like, all that's in my head is the description famous individual, and famous individual doesn't pick out any particular person. Similarly, we might say people in the past successfully referred to mercury even though they had many completely mistaken beliefs about its properties. Arguments along these lines and many others prompted the development of causal theories of reference. According to the causal theory, the reference of a name is fixed by an act of dubbing or baptism. So, for instance, somebody points at a baby and says, "I call that baby John Cage." And then as the name is passed from person to person, users of the name refer to the appropriate object in virtue of the causal chain that goes back to that initial dubbing event. I can refer to John Cage even if I know nothing about him, because my use of the name John Cage is part of the appropriate causal chain. And then with respect to kinds, such as mercury, again, similar story. The dubbing might simply involve pointing at a silvery liquid in a vial and saying, "This liquid is mercury." The term mercury now refers to the liquid in this vial and to any other substances of the same natural kind, any other substances consisting of atoms that contain 80 protons. This term is then passed from person to person, and everybody who uses the term mercury refers to mercury. They refer to substances consisting of atoms that contain 80 protons in virtue of their utterance being part of a causal chain of utterances that goes back to this initial dubbing event. Crucially, people can refer to this natural kind even if they don't know anything about it. Chemists of the past picked out the natural kind mercury, the kind consisting of atoms that contain 80 protons, even though they knew nothing about atoms or protons. Pretty much all of the descriptions associated with the term mercury could be wrong, but people would still refer to atoms containing 80 protons, provided the appropriate dubbing event and causal chain of uses has taken place. So there are many arguments for and against both theories. I'm not going to get into the details of the debate in this video. It would, well, take a whole series, I suppose, to go into detail about them. No, what I want to do here is present an alternative, referential pluralism. Referential pluralism claims that both theories, and perhaps others, are correct. More precisely, according to referential pluralism, there is more than one reference relation. When I use the name John Cage, sometimes it refers in virtue of the associated descriptions, sometimes in virtue of causal chains of reference burrowing, and perhaps sometimes in virtue of other kinds of reference relations. The mechanisms of reference may change from context to context. Now, there are two types of referential pluralism. According to modest pluralism, each term token has a determinate reference relation, but different tokens of the same term type refer in different ways. So suppose Verity says John Cage was an American composer, and Sydney also says John Cage was an American composer. According to modest pluralism, it may be the case that in Verity's utterance, John Cage refers to John Cage in virtue of a set of descriptions that Verity associates with the name, while in Sydney's utterance, John Cage refers to John Cage in virtue of its being part of a causal chain going back to the initial dubbing event when Cage was first named. So in this case, we have different tokens of the same type, right? Like the name John Cage as a type. Each token of that type has a determinate reference relation, but we can't say what the reference relation of the name itself is. According to radical pluralism, for each term token, there is no fact of the matter how that token refers. So when Verity says John Cage was an American composer, she refers to John Cage, but there's no fact of the matter whether this is due to Cage satisfying a set of descriptions, or due to the causal chain of utterances going back to the dubbing event, or due to something else. We might model Verity's usage in terms of either the descriptive theory or the causal theory, but in both cases, this must be understood as an idealization. My own inclination is towards radical pluralism, but I mean, either way, the point is that when individuated by type, there is no fact of the matter how terms refer. Now, before we turn to the task of arguing for pluralism, it's worth asking the question, what kind of evidence could there be for a theory of reference? I mean, this is sort of important. Like, how do we actually go about evaluating theories of reference? Stephen Stitch, in his book Deconstructing the Mind, points out that this depends on what we take the goal of a theory of reference to be. One option is that the goal of our theory of reference is to capture our intuitions about reference. In this case, we consider how well various theories of reference line up with our intuitions about how words refer in specific cases. A second option is that our theory of reference should describe some part of the underlying psychological mechanisms that actually guide our use of words. In this case, intuitions are not necessarily relevant because such mechanisms might not be accessible to consciousness. So in this case then, you need to look at the actual patterns of language use. So you need to look at historical evidence. So I mean, broadly speaking, there's going to be two sources of evidence for a theory of reference. We can look at people's intuitions about how words refer, and we can look at the actual uses of words in our languages. And I do think that, certainly it seems like a reasonable constraint on any theory of reference is that it needs to be compatible with how languages are actually used. So I'm going to give some initial reasons for thinking that these sources of evidence lead us to referential pluralism. I don't think this is in any way a knockdown argument, but I think it should at least put pluralism on the table. It should give us some reason for taking it seriously. Okay, first of all then, intuitions about reference. To get people's intuitions about reference, we present them with various scenarios, and then we ask them what they take the terms to refer to. So a classic example of this is Kripke's Gödel-Schmidt case. The only thing that most people know about Gödel is that he proved the completeness theorem. Now, suppose we discover, looking through his old letters and manuscripts and so on, we discover that he didn't prove it. In fact, he stole it from his friend Schmidt. So then the description, the man who proved the completeness theorem, would be satisfied not by the man that we have been calling Gödel, but by Schmidt. So in this scenario then, what does the name Gödel refer to? Who does it refer to? Here we're asking for your intuitions about reference. Because if you take it to refer to the same man as before, then it looks like you have intuitions that favour the causal theory. If you take it instead to refer to Schmidt, so that Gödel just is Schmidt, then your intuitions favour the descriptivist theory. Because after all, in this scenario, it's Schmidt who satisfies the description, the man who proved the completeness theorem. Now, these kinds of cases have actually been put to people. The available studies on this matter seem to suggest that people's intuitions about reference diverge. Macquarie, Mallon, Nichols and Stitch, in their article Semantics, Cross-Cultural Style, report a study in which they presented subjects from America and Hong Kong with stories designed to elicit intuitions about reference, including the Gödel-Schmidt case. They found that American subjects tended to have causal intuitions. So Americans would tend to take the name Gödel to refer to the same man as before the discovery of the plagiarism, while the Chinese students had descriptivist intuitions. They took Gödel to refer to Schmidt. Beebe and Underkoffer, in Individual and Cross-Cultural Differences in Semantic Intuitions, found that different personality traits correlated with different intuitions about reference. People who were conscientious, emotionally stable and open to new experiences were far more likely to have causal intuitions. Giannone and Lombroso, in Concept Possession, Experimental Semantics and Hybrid Theories of Reference, found that slightly different scenarios elicited divergent intuitions about reference. Similarly, Stephen Stitch, in the aforementioned book Deconstructing the Mind, reports that based on an informal study, minor changes to the wording of a scenario elicited different intuitions about how words refer. So, there does seem to be some evidence that intuitions about reference vary cross-culturally and within cultures and maybe even within a single individual, depending on how scenarios are presented. Now, of course, I don't put too much weight on this kind of evidence. There are only a few studies done, and obviously we're dealing with some initial forays by philosophers into psychology. We have all of the standard problems of the replication crisis and all of that. I think there have actually been later studies that try to replicate some of these, and it's questionable whether these results hold. So, the evidence is maybe not particularly compelling on this point. But those are just some places you might start, should you be interested in experimental philosophy. Okay then, so second we can look at historical usage. Theories of reference make empirical predictions about how our use of terms will change in response to new discoveries. So consider some set of entities to which we apply the term X, and suppose that when we examine these entities, it turns out that they have very few of the properties that we thought they did. So that is, our theory concerning these entities radically changes. Well, descriptivist theories of reference predict that in response to this, we will conclude that X's do not exist, and so we will stop using the term X. After all, for the descriptivist, terms refer to whatever satisfies the associated set of descriptions. If it turns out that nothing satisfies those descriptions, we would stop using the term. By contrast, causal theories predict that we will conclude that X's exist, but that we were mistaken about many of their properties, so we would continue to apply the term X to those entities. On causal theories, reference is not tied to any set of descriptions. We might be completely mistaken about the properties of some entity or kind, but still successfully refer to it. Now, an initial survey of theoretical changes in the past suggests that sometimes some cases match the descriptivist prediction while others match the causal prediction. Here are some cases that match the descriptivist prediction, where we conclude that the thing or entity simply doesn't exist when we realise that we were mistaken about many of its properties. Ether, the luminiferous ether that was thought to be the medium through which waves of light travelled. Caloric, from caloric theories of heat, the heat-containing substance. Canali, or canals, which were thought to exist on the surface of Mars. Conatus, the innate inclination of a thing to continue to exist and to enhance itself, which was superseded by inertia and conservation of momentum. Electrical effluvia, fluid theories of electricity, postulated something called electrical effluvia. Geosyncline, this is a geological process that was used to explain mountain building. It's been replaced by concepts of plate tectonics, such as subduction zones and geoclines. Hysteria, this was a mental disorder primarily diagnosed in women. It's now believed that the symptoms were caused by a disparate range of conditions, such as schizophrenia and anxiety. Impetus, this was a development of Aristotelian physics. Like conatus, it has been superseded by concepts of inertia, momentum, things like that. Miasma theories of disease, bad airs, thought to be the cause of disease. Nebulium, and similarly coronium actually, but nebulium were so unusual emission lines in nebula were hypothesized to be caused by a new element. The emission lines were later discovered to be due to doubly ionized oxygen. Similarly, coronium, that was unusual emission lines in the spectrum from the sun. That turned out to be iron and various other things, but just at the very high temperatures. Phlogiston, planet X. So in the early 1900s, the astronomer Percival Lowell predicted the existence of a ninth planet beyond Neptune, which he dubbed Planet X. The prediction of Planet X was based on apparent discrepancies in the orbit of Uranus. It is now known that there were no such discrepancies. But Lowell's prediction initiated a search program that led directly to Clyde Tombaugh discovery of Pluto. And indeed, after the discovery of Pluto, Pluto was called Planet X for some time before its current name was applied. So, the name Planet X was not merely part of a prediction, but it was actually in use after the prediction was erroneously thought to have been confirmed. It is now widely agreed Pluto is not Planet X. So we don't say that, Pluto is Planet X, but Lowell was mistaken about many of its properties. Rather, we say nothing is Planet X, right? Like Lowell just failed to refer to anything when he postulated that planet. The name Planet X fails to refer. So here we have a bunch of cases where entities or kinds were eliminated from our ontology when it was found that nothing answered to our descriptions of them. We didn't say, oh, okay, turns out that miasmas are really small organisms as opposed to bad air produced by rotting organic matter. No, we said miasmas don't exist. And people in the past were wrong to think that they did exist. They weren't just mistaken about some of their properties, they were wrong to think that these things existed. Their terms failed to refer. Here are some cases confirming the causal prediction, where we conclude that X's do exist and that people in the past were referring to X's despite being mistaken about properties of X's. Atom, comet, dark nebula. So astronomers of the pre-1900s held a wholly incorrect theory of dark nebula. They believed them to be vacant regions of the sky rather than opaque interstellar clouds. Nevertheless, we take it that they successfully referred to dark nebula. Electron, gene, hallucinogenia. Hallucigenia was a strange animal from the Cambrian period. Scientists were initially very mistaken about its characteristics because they reconstructed it upside down and back to front. Mass, mesosome. Mesosomes were folds in the plasma membrane of cells. They were originally thought to just be a natural part of the cell that served important functions, but they later turned out to be artifacts of the fixation process used in electron microscopy. But we still talk about mesosomes and so on. Planets, species, star. Stars initially were thought to be part of the crystalline spheres, not sort of hot balls of gas. Unconscious. For Freud, the unconscious was intertwined with various psychoanalytic concepts and practices. Concepts like psychological repression and practices like dream analysis. Contemporary cognitive scientists accept the unconscious, but reject most of Freud's specific claims. And note that in many of these cases, we came to reject not just minor parts of the associated descriptions, but the most fundamental and basic beliefs about these things. Originally, electrons were thought to be particles, that were by definition the minimum unit of electric charge. The term electron was introduced by George Stoney specifically to refer to, and I quote, the fundamental unit quantity of electricity. But electrons, as it turns out, are not particles in anything like the sense that early 20th century physicists thought. We now model them as clouds of probabilities extending over an infinite range and that exhibit wave-particle duality. Moreover, electrons do not bear the minimum electric charge. Some quarks are now thought to have a charge of, minus 1/3, I think, of an electron. Anyway, what all of this shows is that if some theory is shown to be substantially incorrect, from this fact alone, it seems like it's impossible to predict whether we will take the terms of that theory to be non-referring, as the descriptivist would expect, or whether we will take the terms of that theory to be referring, but just associated with different descriptions from what was initially thought, as the causal theorist would expect. And notice, furthermore, that these examples are drawn from the science. An important feature of scientific discourse is that it's far more specialised and more precise than everyday discourse. If, even in science, there is no single reference relation, then it looks like there's going to be little hope for monism with respect to language in general. Okay, a third piece of evidence is that there are some cases where research communities will explicitly adopt a particular reference mechanism for some class of their terms. And here we find, as before, that no single reference mechanism is always favoured. At different times, both descriptive and causal mechanisms have been employed. Nicholas Best, in his article Meta-Incommensurability Between Theories of Meaning, presents evidence of this from the history of chemistry. Prior to the chemical revolution of the 1700s, the theory of reference for chemical elements was, Best says, descriptive. In Paracelsus's theory, for example, all chemicals are reducible to 3 principles. The principles are mercury, sulfur, and salt. The mercury principle is not the liquid metal itself, but is rather a theoretical abstraction named after the metal. The principles were thought of as ideal substances, perhaps analogous to Platonic forms, that were instantiated by matter, but that could not themselves be handled or manipulated. Since people did not have direct causal access to these principles, they were defined descriptively in terms of their characteristic properties. However, after the chemical revolution, elements were identified by laboratory analysis. Lavoisier defined an element as any substance that could not be further decomposed by analysis. And according to Best, this rests on a causal theory of reference. I quote, "A chemist who succeeds in decomposing a substance into new, simpler components forges a causal chain that transforms the chemical community into a linguistic community for the new natural kind." For example, following Davy's work, potassium named the substance obtained by electrolysing melted caustic potash. Any further descriptions were irrelevant. Davy obtained a particular substance and dubbed it potassium. Later chemists then picked up the word, and they all referred to potassium, even if many of their beliefs about potassium were mistaken, because their use of the term was part of a causal chain extending back to Davy's initial decomposition of caustic potash. An equally striking example of this can be found in biological systematics. Before the Darwinian revolution, systematists assumed an essentialist view of species, according to which each species has an immutable essence and is sharply separated from all other species. Species instantiate abstract types, and variation within species is conceived as imperfection in the instantiation of the type. So in this view, a name such as Echinocactus grissoni, I have no idea whether that's the correct pronunciation, is associated with a set of descriptions which specify its type. So spherical plant, yellow spines attached to the areoles, small flowers that grow in summer, and so on. Then whatever entities satisfy these descriptions are classed as Echinocactus grissoni. The Darwinian revolution brought the view that there are no sharp boundaries between species, that variation is central to the origin of species, and that any species can change radically in the future. There are no essences. In principle, the only limits to how much a species may change are those limits imposed by physical laws. This view prompted the development of a new method of systematics, the type specimen method. So in this method, a particular organism, the type specimen, is chosen and named, and that name is then taken to designate a certain part of the genealogical tree, the tree of ancestor-descendant relations. Importantly, the type specimen need not be typical of the species. The search for a typical specimen is futile given the ubiquity of variation and the possibility of indefinite change in the future. So on this method of naming, Echinocactus grissoni now names a certain type specimen, a single individual, plus any other organism that has the appropriate genealogical connections to this specimen. And this is a causal mechanism of reference because we might be completely mistaken about the properties of those organisms, but we still refer to them because of the connection they bear to the type specimen. We refer to a species successfully because our use of the term extends back to an event where some scientists dubbed a particular type specimen with the name. Again, when we look at cases where people have explicitly adopted a particular reference relation, well, sometimes it's descriptive, sometimes it's causal. Okay, there is an objection to appealing to these sources of evidence to support referential pluralism, which is that they overlook the possibility of widespread error. We make mistakes about spelling, grammar, punctuation, and so on, so why not also about reference? Consider the buffalo sentence. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. That sentence is grammatically correct, but obviously that's extremely counterintuitive, and in everyday discourse it would just be confusing to say it. Nobody would ever use a sentence like this in normal conversation. So both our intuitions and our patterns of actual language use may suggest to us that the buffalo sentence is ungrammatical, but this is incorrect. Furthermore, examples like this aren't exactly rare, right? We could construct an indefinite number of them. So similarly, the referential monist might say, look, the evidence that's been cited in support of pluralism, well, really all that's going on there is that sometimes we are all mistaken that a word refers or fails to refer. So the causal theorist might insist that we're just wrong to think that the term miasma doesn't refer. Similarly, the descriptivist might insist that we're wrong to think that the term atom does refer, or at least scientists in 1910 or whatever, those people in the past, when it was discovered that atoms had very different properties than what was expected, they were wrong to think that the term atom did refer. So I think there are 2 points to make about this. First, when you look at the buffalo sentence, the appearance of ungrammaticality evaporates when we parse it properly. It does take some effort to do this, but it can be read as a perfectly reasonable English sentence. And I think the way to do this is to substitute different terms for the 3 distinct meanings of buffalo. So in the buffalo sentence, the term buffalo is being used to refer to the place, right, the city of Buffalo. It's being used to refer to the animal, a buffalo, and it's also being used as a verb meaning to bully. So if you take something like, for instance, Detroit Buffalo bully, bully Detroit Buffalo, or Detroit Buffalo, that Detroit Buffalo bully, also bully Detroit Buffalo. Again, if you think about that, it becomes a lot more intuitive that actually, no, this is perfectly grammatically correct. On the other hand, the idea that miasma refers, or that atom fails to refer, those remain odd no matter how well educated you are about reference and semantics and so on. Second point here is that even granting this response, right, even if we accept that actually terms like miasma refer, or that terms like atom fail to refer, well, it's not really clear that saves referential monism. So if the causal theorist says that miasma refers, and hence there are miasmas, it just turns out that miasmas are not bad airs, but certain populations of microorganisms, or if the descriptivist says that atom fails to refer, and hence there are no atoms, we can respond, well, okay, why then should we care about reference? I mean, clearly reference isn't what's governing our actual uses of terms. Reference isn't in practice how those words connect to things in the world. What matters for actual language use must instead be some sort of, let's say, pseudo-reference. So perhaps miasma refers, but it doesn't pseudo-refer. And since there are no miasmas, pseudo-reference is what matters in this case. In other words, pluralism is just pushed one step back. If we insist that there is one single real reference relation, then it will turn out that this relation isn't what matters in many cases. There's still a plurality of ways that words hook up to the world. One of those ways is designated reference, and the others are kinds of pseudo-reference. This is pluralism in monist clothing. Okay, so that's the case for referential pluralism. As I mentioned, there's not a great deal about it that's been written in the literature. However, one major argument against it has been raised by Mallon, Macquarie, Nichols and Stitch in their article Against Arguments from Reference. So they argue that referential pluralism poses problems for communication because it entails that we will be unable to tell whether people genuinely agree or disagree, or whether they are simply talking past each other. Their argument essentially goes as follows. Premise 1. Two people genuinely agree or disagree about X only if their uses of X have the same reference relation. Premise 2. Referential pluralism entails that we don't know whether any two people have the same reference relation for a given use of X. Conclusion. Referential pluralism entails that we don't know when two people genuinely agree or disagree about X, or when they simply talk past each other. So in support of premise 1, that two people genuinely agree or disagree about X only if their uses of X have the same reference relation. In support of this claim, suppose that for Verity, X refers descriptively, while for Sydney, X refers causally. Verity and Sydney agree that most of our beliefs about X are wrong, so Verity concludes that X's don't exist. Sydney maintains that X's do exist. We just have various wrong beliefs about them. Here, Verity's assertion X's don't exist and Sydney's assertion X's do exist don't contradict each other. So just to fill in the details, right, we might take X to mean electron, where electrons are defined in terms of the plum pudding model of the atom. Verity and Sydney are two scientists in the early 1900s. Verity's claim that electrons don't exist turns out to be true, because we know the plum pudding model is false, and so the set of descriptions associated with the term electron are not satisfied by anything in the world. Sydney's claim that electrons do exist is also true, because from a causal point of view, well, the term electron refers to whatever it is that's being shot through cathode ray tubes so as to produce images on a phosphorescent screen. And there are things that are doing that, right? We are referring to something in that case. So Verity and Sydney are not really disagreeing, because when Verity denies the existence of electrons and Sydney affirms the existence of electrons, the term electron is being used with different reference relations. The moral of the story: genuine agreement and disagreement requires sameness of reference. So as for P2, that referential pluralism entails that we don't know whether any two people have the same reference relation for a given use of term X. Well, the crucial point is that a person's explicit view about the reference of a term X doesn't tell us how that term actually refers for them. Mallon et al. Point out that descriptivism was very popular until Kripke's attack on it, at which point the causal theory became dominant. Now, importantly, what Kripke did was to prompt intuitions that philosophers already had. He didn't have to argue that in the Gödel-Schmidt case, the term Gödel refers to Gödel and not to Schmidt. Philosophers had causal intuitions, but just didn't realise it. So before Kripke, many philosophers would have assumed that their uses of a name referred descriptively, when in fact, the argument would go, they apparently referred causally. Or perhaps they referred in some other way. The important point is, we can be completely wrong about how it is that our words refer. We can be completely wrong about the reference relation that obtains between our words and the world. Now, if I don't know what the reference relation is for my own use of X, and if there are many legitimate reference relations, then I can't know whether the reference relation for my use of X is the same as the reference relation for your use of X. So referential pluralism entails we don't know whether two people have the same reference relation for a given use of X. So I think there are some problems with both premises of Mallon et al.'s argument. So with respect to premise 1, the main problem here is that in general meanings are vague and ambiguous, but this poses no real difficulties for communication. Suppose I'm talking about my computer, right? Now that term, computer, am I talking about the laptop alone, or am I talking about the laptop plus the external mouse? I think a better question is, why would it matter? In the vast majority of circumstances, it just makes no difference. For instance, I might say to somebody who is helping me move house, hey, be careful with that box, it has my computer inside it. Or I might say to somebody requesting information, oh, I don't know, I'll look it up on the internet when I go on my computer tonight. The exact boundaries of the object can be indeterminate here. And if you draw the boundaries slightly different to me, you can still disagree with my assertions. So let's say, I use the term computer to refer to the laptop alone, you use the term computer to refer to the laptop plus the external mouse. When I say, that box has my computer in it, you can disagree with me. And that's a genuine disagreement despite the difference in meaning. Moreover, in those few cases where it does make a difference, meaning can easily be clarified. Like I can say, give him my old computer, but I want the external mouse back. I can say something like that. And even if I don't say something like that, the communication has still been partially successful. So like when I say give him my old computer, meaning the laptop but not the external mouse, and you assume that I mean the laptop plus the external mouse, well, even here, a misunderstanding with practical consequences has arisen, but we're not simply talking past each other. You're still going to pick up the computer and not, for instance, my phone or a spoon. So James Andow, in his article Intuitions, Disagreement and Referential Pluralism, he points out, communication doesn't require exact overlap of meanings. There are degrees of communicative success. Andow considers the sentence, I only play the trumpet. One person hears this with a deep knowledge of trumpets, another knows only that trumpets are wind instruments, another person hearing this mishears the word trumpet, maybe there's some sudden noise. Now the speaker successfully communicates with each person, though obviously more is communicated to the first than the third. And I would add that, the person who misses the word trumpet could genuinely disagree with the speaker despite only hearing part of their statement. They could object, you don't play anything, you're not musical at all. They could say something like that. So similarly then, there is no reason to assume that genuine disagreement requires sameness of reference relations. What about premise 2? Well, I would suggest that we determine how other people refer by considering contextual cues and applying standard conversational maxims, plus a general principle of charity. So we interpret utterances in such a way as to maximize their truth and rationality. I won't go into detail on this, but if you want more background, look up Grice's maxims. An example should hopefully suffice to make the general point. If we're talking to a man who's known for strongly materialist and naturalist views, and he says God exists, and he explains that he identifies God with the totality of natural phenomena, well, it's pretty clear that we should take the term God in a causal historical manner. If we were to interpret it descriptively, that would require attributing to him all sorts of contradictory beliefs. Because, on the descriptive view, God is a supernatural benevolent creator with various thoughts and desires, and this man has explicitly denied the existence of such a thing. It's also obvious that when I say God does not exist, I'm not actually disagreeing with him, since I'm not using the term with the same reference relation. It would be absurd to deny that the totality of natural phenomena exists, whatever it happens to be. A more charitable interpretation is that when I say God does not exist, I mean to deny some specific conception of God. Or when a religious person says God exists and then presents various arguments for the conclusion that there is a single omnipotent creator of the universe, well, presumably their use of the term God should be interpreted descriptively. If we interpret it causally, we would be interpreting them as violating conversational maxims of relevance and non-ambiguity. Because on a causal interpretation, the term God can refer to things other than a single omnipotent creator, which, in that context would be irrelevant and liable to cause confusion. If the believer were to concede an atheist's objections to his arguments, but then to insist that the term God can refer to more than just an omnipotent creator, the atheist would quite reasonably accuse him of changing the subject. So, in this kind of example, look, we're just picking up on the contextual cues, we're applying the conversational maxims, and, that tells us how people, what people mean and how their terms refer. And all of this is a matter of competence. Rarely are we consciously aware of any of it. So I think that Mallon et al. Are correct that a person's explicit views about reference aren't necessarily relevant. But notice that Mallon et al.'s argument can be understood in two ways. When we look at premise 2, So referential pluralism entails that we don't know whether any two people have the same reference relation for a given use of X. But, well, when we look at that premise, we can take that term know in two different senses. We might take it to mean knowledge that, right? Propositional knowledge, beliefs, that kind of thing. Or we might take it to mean knowledge how, that is, skills and abilities. Now, if we understand it in the first way, then I think premise 2 is absolutely right. We often don't have propositional knowledge of how the terms that other people use refer. But genuine agreement and disagreement doesn't require propositional knowledge of this, it only requires the appropriate know-how. Most people have no propositional knowledge whatsoever of any theories of reference, and that's the case no matter what we say about referential pluralism. In the same way, successful communication doesn't require propositional knowledge of Grice's conversational maxims. Nobody had propositional knowledge of Grice's conversational maxims prior to the 20th century. I think it was around the 1960s when Grice proposed them. Maybe it was the 50s. But anyway, very recently, right, compared to the whole history of human communication was getting on perfectly fine without propositional knowledge of Grice's conversational maxims. So, we don't need propositional knowledge of these things for communication to be successful. On the other hand, if we take premise 2 as a claim about knowledge how, then I think it should be rejected. The standard interpretive tricks allow us to fairly rapidly develop a tacit understanding of the references of terms in particular contexts. Right, that's all. That is the brief case for referential pluralism, at least a case for taking it seriously. And that's everything. Thanks for watching.